Hey, welcome back! There are two kinds of lenses that you can attach to your camera. Either it's a prime lens or it's a zoom lens. Prime lenses have a fixed focal length, such as 50 millimeters. Zoom lens can cover an entire range, for example, from 24 millimeters to 70 millimeters. Turning the ring on the lens allows you to zoom in, or in other words, change the focal length. Now, prime lenses tend to be of a better quality, as they are easier to build and maintain that better optical quality. That's why they are cheaper than zoom lenses of equal quality. So that's the backstory. But now, what are those millimeters that I was talking about, and how does it affect our shots? Well, there are three distinct focal differences. You've got wide angle. In an extreme way, we can even call this fisheye. Normal, which is close to how we see the world, or the focal length of our eyes. And finally, tele, which is zoomed in. We can see things closer than they appear in real life. Now, the human eye sits somewhere at around 50 millimeters. That's why a 50 millimeter lens is so popular. Anything below that is wide angle. So a 20 millimeter lens looks something like this, a very wide angle view. On the opposite side, a 100 millimeter lens is zoomed in. We talk about a telephoto in short. Now, there's a lot more going on when changing the focal length. In fact, we're going to take a look at three different side effects that any focal length comes with. Here we have a medium shot of our talent at a 100 millimeters focal length. And here's that same shot, again a medium framing at 20 millimeters. The first thing we notice is the background. In a wide angle shot, we can see a lot more of the environment than with the tele lens. This is because of the field of view that changes. Starting at wide angle, we have a large field of view, and as we zoom in, it becomes more narrow. And doing this trick right here with your arms really helps visualizing what happens. So when a background is less important, you might want to zoom in a little bit more. When it is more important and you want to show more of the environment, maybe zoom out and stand closer to the subject. It is very important to be aware of this. Don't just zoom in because it's easier, because maybe the better choice is to zoom out and actually stand closer to the subject. The same effect of the field of view can be found back on the talent itself. See what it does to the face. It expands the face more in a wide shot, and it compresses it more in a tele shot. That is why beauty shots are always filmed at 50 millimeters and above. 80 millimeters, for instance, is something that is oftentimes used in fashion because it makes you look more beautiful, more pleasing. A wide shot makes you look funny and weird. So are you filming comedy or something more serious like fashion? Now you know which kind of focal length to choose. So that was the first thing, field of view. The second thing is depth of field, and we talked about this before. Having an open aperture creates a more shallow depth of field. The area that is in focus is smaller. Now, in closing the aperture, that focus field or depth of field becomes larger. We can put more things in focus. And the same thing occurs when zooming in or zooming out. Zoomed out or at wide angle, we have a large depth of field. Very wide angle lenses like those fisheyes even put everything into focus. That's one of the reasons why those action cameras like the GoPro has such a wide angle lens. There is no focus option, so these action cameras need to have a wide angle lens so that everything is in focus. But then the more that we start to zoom in, the shallower that the depth of field becomes. Oftentimes, a cameraman will close its aperture a little bit more when filming on a tele lens. That way, you can make your focus field a little bit bigger again, making it easier to keep things in focus. So if you want to achieve that cinematic shallow depth of field, you simply film from a bigger focal length or zoom in. And that brings us to the last effect that the focal length has, which is the audience perspective. The audience, or the people that watch your videos, see everything through the camera. That's obvious. So they experience the story that you're telling from the camera perspective. Now, if we film our subject from a distance and zoom in, the audience also feels that they are far away. They are looking at something from a distance, and this, again, is a visual storytelling technique, which I talked about before. Looking at something from a distance creates that safe feeling. Now, we are not involved as we are looking at the situation, and we're not part of the situation. Now, opposite, we could zoom out and go wide angle and stand really close to the subject. Suddenly the audience stands right next to the subject. They are part of the situation now. During an action scene, the audience feels in danger as well. So the focal length allows you to place the audience where you want. A very powerful tool within visual storytelling. Alright, so that is how different focal lengths work. But now when you go out to the store and buy that very nifty 50 millimeter lens, you might notice that that it doesn't actually compare to the human eye. In fact, it might be more tele. It feels maybe something like 80 millimeters. How is that possible? Have I been lying the entire time? Don't worry, I haven't. The thing is that in order to see the full 50mm lens, you'll need actually a full-frame sensor. That's a little chip which sits inside your camera body. Hang on, let me just grab one of those. It has a certain physical size. The bigger the size, the more it will cover from the actual lens. So if you have a smaller sensor, you're only capturing a smaller portion of that lens. Basically, you're cropping in on the video. Now, full-frame sensors like this one right here are definitely a thing, but something like an APS-H or an APS-C sensor like this camera are super popular too. You know, and these sensor sizes can be found in anything like a Sony, a Nikon, a Canon camera, doesn't matter. In terms of size, they all have kind of their own flavor, but it comes roughly down to the same thing. Now, Micro Four Thirds is also a very popular sensor size, which is even smaller than this one. You know, these sit in the Panasonic Lumix cameras. So that means in order to have a 50mm view, you actually need to buy a 35mm lens if your camera has an APS-sized sensor. And the reason that I know that is because I can look up the crop factor. This is a multiplier number such as 1.5, which is for APS-C sensors. So a 35mm lens times 1.5 comes down to roughly around 50mm on an APS-C sensor. For a Micro Four Thirds sensor, you need to multiply by 2. So you want to look at a 25mm lens or 24mm, which is easier to find. You know, that way you can have that 50mm field of view. You know, and to make it even more complicated than it already is, I'm sorry guys, I didn't invent this, but lenses can also be made specifically for a specific sensor size. So that means that you have full-frame lenses, you have APS-C lenses, you have Micro Four Thirds lenses. Now their crop factor remains the same, so that's nothing to worry about, but their coverage on the other hand is different. You know, an APS-C lens is only so big that it covers the size of an APS-C sensor and everything below. So that also means Micro Four Thirds sensors, but not a full-frame sensor. If you put an APS-C lens on a full-frame camera sensor, you will start to see a vignette of the actual lens. That's because it's not big enough to cover the entire sensor. And this is very important to know when you're going to look out for a new lens. If you choose to buy a lens for a certain sensor size, it means that you cannot use it anymore when you're going to buy a camera in the future, which might have a bigger sensor size. So ideally, you buy full-frame lenses, but they are way more expensive. They're bigger and they're heavier. That's a choice that you have to make for yourself. I have a set of APS-C lenses since most cameras do utilize that size of sensor. Full frame is more often used in photography and not that much within videography. So that is what you need to know about lenses. If you have any questions or perhaps you're thinking about buying a new lens or anything of that, let me know in the discussion down below, guys, and I'd be happy to give you some advice on that.